Hi, welcome to Be with the Word. I'm Dr. Gerry Creed, and I am your host. And this is episode 58 of Be with the Word. And we're so excited because this is the Feast of the Holy Family. And it's also wishing you a Merry Christmas because this show usually comes out on a Tuesday. And this week it'll be the right before Christmas. So we're going to kind of bring in some Christmas items, but the scriptural focus is the Holy Family. Well, I am so excited this week because I have a special guest, and that is Dr. Laura Cusimano, and she has a doctorate in clinical psychology from Divine Mercy University. And Dr. Laura, so nice to see you. Welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, could you just say a few words about you and your
Sure.
life situation a bit?
Absolutely. I graduated in 2017 from Divine Mercy University with my doctorate in clinical psychology. As you said, I spent my internship year working with people with eating disorders. That has been my passion for many years. So while I treat people with many presenting concerns, I really love to focus on specializing with people with eating disorders. So I spent my internship year at a program in Minnesota, an eating disorder treatment facility. And then I returned to Virginia, where Divine Mercy University is located, and I completed my postdoctoral residency at a private practice in Northern Virginia, where I worked with people with eating disorders and also people with disorders of over control in general. So I have specialization in eating disorders and radically open dialectical behavior therapy. I have intensive training in that as well. So that's pretty much my passion, my area of expertise. And I currently live in North Carolina with my husband and our three young children. They're 3, 17 months, and 1 month old today. So we keep busy.
Congratulations. I
Thank
understand
you.
your baby was born on the Feast of the Immaculate Conception.
My first one
Oh,
was
your
my
first
first
one was.
baby.
All
Yes.
right.
And then, yep.
That
So then
seems like a positive sign to me. I don't
I
know.
know. I thought, oh, she's the Blessed Mother wants her. That's what I
That's right. Well, you know what's great is that I've been doing this show now. It's just been over a year, and this year for this new Advent, I've been doing the show and bringing in guests as much as I can. And I was actually got a message from one of our listeners, a listener in Toronto. Hey there, and she said, "Could you do the topic of eating disorders?" And my initial reaction was, I actually don't work with that very much. It's not like if somebody came into my practice, I would be like with an eating disorder, I would refer them because it's just, I mean, I might be able to help somewhat, but it's actually not my area. And so I went, okay. And I reached out to some friends who knows someone who specializes in eating disorders, and your name came up. So it's
Well,
been
I'm
a
honored.
pleasure to meet with you.
Well, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, so we're this topic, and I think it's so important. This is Christmas week for many, and then right after Christmas, and then New Year's is coming up. So food is on a lot of people's minds. I know I am often like, I do struggle with weight
Mhm.
gain. And so this is the time of year where I'm supposed to splurge, but at the same time, so the whole issue of food is a big one for people. And so I figured this is a great time to do this topic. Could you share a little bit? Because I understand you told me you have a journey. You've had a
Mhm.
journey yourself
I
with
do.
eating disorders. So I would love if you'd share with our listeners a little bit about that.
Absolutely. So I did go through my own eating disorder when I was in college. I was about 19, and earlier in my life, I like to think back that I'd never been interested in psychology until college, and I never really knew anything about eating disorders. I think I took a semester long introduction course in high school. We had some kind of psychology elective, and I took that class, and I remember seeing the term eating disorders, and I thought, well, that's kind of strange and unusual, and didn't really think anything of it. And then when I was in college, I found myself living through one. So it was between my freshman and my sophomore year where the onset occurred. I had struggled a lot with self-confidence. And one thing in particular was that I was really longing to date. I felt really called. I felt very strongly as a child, even, that my vocation was to marriage and motherhood. And so I thought, well, I'm going to meet somebody in college. I'm going to meet the man that I'm supposed to marry. I did not realize that was not God's plan for me. And I could not figure out what was, quote unquote wrong with me. So I had always been very academically inclined when I was younger and through high school and college. And so my mom had said, oh, you intimidate the boys, or, don't worry about these guys, back when I was in high school. But then I went to college and I thought, we're all supposed to be smart here. And
Right.
so I'm on a level playing field. Why aren't guys knocking on my door to ask me out on a date? And I really struggled. So what I thought, at some point, it occurred to me very incorrectly, but that it had to potentially do with the way that I looked. And
Mm.
so I found myself becoming very engrossed with all sorts of numbers, calories, minutes spent at the gym. I'd never gone to the gym prior in my life. I just played and been like a kid, danced, sang, that's how I moved my body and had joyful movement. But things became very different and very, I would say, rigid for me. So I found myself falling into anorexia. And in the span of a few short months, I lost a considerable amount of weight for my height, and I really struggled. I suffered by weighing all my food. Like it was just very, very unusual behavior.
What do
And
you
unfortunately,
think was propelling that? Like the fact that, because that seems like a really big sudden shift then. It all
yeah,
of a sudden became like an obsession, like it became like all you could think about was these numbers and
yes.
these things that you had to do.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah, and I think obsession is a perfect word for this. I I like to focus on things, and I think that for a lot of people who suffer from eating disorders, food is an area that we tend to think that we have a lot of control over. There's not a lot of control in many areas of life, and so this became something that I could control. I could monitor. I couldn't control if boys or guys, men were attracted to me, whatever you want to call college age people. But I couldn't control if they were attracted to me. I couldn't control, uh, you know, the way that they interacted with me. I could only control myself and my behaviors. And so I began focusing very specifically on food and exercise. So I found myself getting sick, and I returned to school, and thanks be to God, I had two wonderful roommates that I had known from my freshman year, and we were living together on campus my sophomore year.
Okay.
And I came to school, and many people noticed a dramatic difference, but had a really difficult time addressing it. I think that a lot of people struggle with, how do we approach someone that we care about who looks like they might be suffering from an
Right.
eating disorder? And
Right.
so
Can I ask you
yeah.
this? Because a lot of people do this, right? Like a lot of people, like say me, like even many times in my life, go, I'm gaining weight, and so
Mhm.
do research, and I'm going to the gym, and I'm
Mhm.
working out, I'm on some diet, whatever. What's the line? What's the line you cross where suddenly that's an obsession and where it's unhealthy?
That line, I'd say, differs for many people. And so I think we all need to know our capacities. And that's part of, I think, going to therapy and learn and growing in self-knowledge and using prayer to discern, like, God, help me to see what is the temperate amount of monitoring versus becoming obsessed. And because I think sometimes we can go in the other direction too, which is, oh, I don't care about anything, right? And then,
Right.
but is that respecting what the capacities and faculties that God has given us? Either that's another question. But I don't want to get too philosophical. But it really, I think, to get back to your question, I really think the line differs from
Mm,
person to person. I don't necessarily believe that there are rules that we want to say, you can't say. Now, I personally, especially for people, when I talk with patients about eating disorders, what that they've had in the past, I personally don't advocate dieting. And I also can recognize that some people think that that's helpful for them.
mm,
I think that can become a very slippery slope, though. So, one
okay.
of the ways to kind of monitor the amount of time one spends in reflecting, or maybe researching, to use the word that you use, would be to consider how much time you're spending on websites or looking at magazines or articles. How much does it impact the conversations that you have? Is it changing the way that you interact with other people? So I know that going back to, and I don't want to segue too much back to my story, but it actually kind of fits here.
Yeah, please.
I have always been an extrovert, and I grew up performing. I have a strong love of musical theater, and I had always had a vibrant personality. And I felt myself shrinking, not just my physical shape, but my personality was shrinking.
Oh, wow.
And I stopped hanging out with friends. I had a wonderful group that I still attribute a lot of my healing to these relationships with my choir at the time. I was in a chamber choir, and I stopped going to dinner with them after rehearsal.
Mm,
So I really went inward. I turned inward. Everything in my life took a backseat to food
right.
and to including my relationship with God. So that was my main focus. I
Mhm.
needed to eat a specific amount of calories and burn a specific amount of calories each day. And so that I think was a real was really a helpful
Well,
point for me, was that I saw the impact that it had on my friendships and my relationships. And I think that that also, going back to you, is if you see it really causing a negative impact in relationships, perhaps that can be a moment to take a pause and say, am I getting too involved?
okay, so relationships and changes there are
Yeah.
important, but you know what I was hitting me here,
Mhm.
and it does link a little bit because I do
Yeah,
want to, obviously bring in the scriptures, and I
absolutely.
thought that the Colossians is one of the ones that was so powerful. I thought in these readings, and that it literally lists, put on God as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, heartfelt compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. And he goes on. But when I
Mhm.
was reading that, what was coming to me in the work that I do, and I do a lot of therapy with internal family systems, which is parts work,
Mhm.
was whoa, the true self.
Mhm.
All those qualities that St. Paul mentions are qualities of our true self created by God. And of course we have individual qualities as well, and unique strengths and unique weaknesses even, but that make us who we are. But what you just said, what hit me,
Mhm.
was that you were losing your identity in this.
Yes. Ab
Yeah, that it changed your need to control. I thought that was powerful too. The
Mhm.
issue of I might not be able to control whether guys are liking me or
Mhm.
getting that attention, but I can control this,
Yep.
right? And then and that need to control, then there becomes a loss of self.
Yes.
Okay, okay.
Yes. Yeah. I think that what you said about the term identity is, and the phrase the loss of identity is so accurate. I really didn't know who I was. And I felt like I was drifting. Um,
Mm.
I had a lot of powerful moments, and if you would like me to expand more on different aspects of the story, I'm happy to do so. But I think
Well,
that,
it might help people to understand too,
yeah,
because even if one of our listeners doesn't have an eating
yeah,
disorder per se, maybe there's a loved one they have that they're concerned about. So it would be really good to know what
yeah,
to look out for.
yeah.
What's the difference between, hey, you're just doing really well and you're like, having this initiative to take care of your body better, versus, oh, this doesn't look healthy to me. I mean, maybe need to talk to them.
Yeah, absolutely. So, my roommates were noticing not just changes in my body, and I think it's important to recognize that from the perspective of an eating disorder specialist, that eating disorders don't always appear in a physical manifestation.
Mm,
So,
okay.
someone can be suffering and physical appearance may or may not change. Most people think of anorexia, for example, as being underweight.
Yeah.
That's one of the clinical aspects of the clinical definition. But anorexia can occur in people who are of average weight or who are even considered overweight. It depends on restriction, the amount of restriction that's going on. So
Mm,
it's not always about what you see with your eyes. So yes, I did have a shift in my physical appearance, but I think what my friends were noticing more was that I was prioritizing getting up extremely early to be at the gym when it opened, because I wasn't about to let this what I didn't consider to be an eating disorder, but I wasn't about to consider or to allow these areas of my life to impact, say, my education or my, so I was going to find a way to fit everything into my life. What did that mean? The one thing that I was really able and willing to cut out was socialization, because a lot of socialization in college revolves around food or doing something where not necessarily even parties or things, but there is some kind of activity. Catholic Campus Ministries, afterwards, they have group, meetings and then snacks. Well, I didn't want to do that. I would go to choir rehearsal, but I wouldn't go to dinner, things like that. So I was really willing to separate the social aspects and cut back on my relationships because I was so focused on reaching my goals. And the goals kept changing. So I have a couple memories of, I think of the gym still to this day. I think of the gym where I went during this time as the scene of my crime, that this is where I really went down a path that it really was an interesting journey that took me off of a path that I thought I was supposed to be on. And I didn't get back onto the path for like 5 or so years, and thanks be to God, I am over a decade recovered completely, past tense with ending. That's another thing, is that there are two different schools of thought. Some people believe in ongoing recovery in the eating disorder specialty world, and a lot of people also believe in full recovery. I am one of the people that believes that you could be fully recovered, past tense, not struggling, and completely free. So we can talk about that more if that becomes relevant. But in terms of my story, it is very relevant. So yes, I spent a lot of time. Now you're going to have to edit this part out.
No, you're fine. Well, can I ask you something? Do you have an opinion on something like, I think it's Overeaters Anonymous?
I do have an opinion. I do. Yeah. So I really strongly believe that there's no such thing as a sugar addiction. There's no such thing as food addiction, because addiction, the way it's defined in, say, the DSM, involves, so if we took the DSM out, and I don't have it with me right now, so I don't know if you have it there, but we could replace the word food for the substance, and it would not work. There are articles
because I do a lot of work with sex addiction.
Yeah,
that's not yet in the DSM either. But if you did replace the word sex for every, alcohol or substance, or whatever, it would fit. So not for food.
Not for food. For exercise, there have been some research articles that have looked at exercise, and exercise, if you replace alcohol or substance with the word exercise, that fits more of the criteria for addiction, because there is, so I remember a specific point in being at the gym that I thought, oh my goodness, I keep going on this machine for longer and longer. How, if I'm here at the gym for this amount of time, and I'm very deliberate in not using numbers, so sharing the numbers, because that can be very upsetting, and to use a common word that we hear, triggering for people with eating disorder tendencies, like disordered eating or eating disorder behaviors. So I'm very specific in not using that. So anyway, I recognized being there. Oh my goodness, I am here feeling like I'm chained to this machine. Was not physically chained to the machine, but feeling like I'm stuck here. And how am I going to do this for the rest of my life?
Oh, wow.
Because I know that at some point you reach tolerance. Your body says, okay, we'll adjust, and physically speaking, your metabolism will change. There are so many different factors that the science, that even, as somebody in the psychological realm and not the nutrition science realm, I don't even know all of the different things that happens to one's body when this goes on. But all of a sudden your body will recalibrate and say, okay, well, we can tolerate this. So if you want to continue losing weight, you need to do more. And so I remember
enslavement. To me, that sounds like horror. Like I have gone to the gym. I sometimes go to the gym more than other times in my life, but I certainly don't, like, no one could accuse me of having an addiction. But
Mhm.
what you just described helped me to see, wow, if that's your thought process, no wonder you would feel like entrapped
Yep.
in some
Yep.
way.
And that was, I remember very clearly. And that was, I don't even know if I did seek treatment. So that was, but I don't even know if I was in therapy at that time when I recognized that. Um, it was a very powerful thought. And I remember my mom making a comment too, saying like, how do you expect to do all these things with your life that you want to do and keep this up? I thought it was a really nice way to bring it up without
Mm,
it was a nice, gentle challenge and not an accusatory challenge. It was just like a, how do you think this is going to work? Made it broadened my perspective
okay.
when she brought
Now, when I think of food, like, that's interesting, the whole exercise component,
that. Mhm,
and I could see that as a sort of an addiction and giving you a sense of control. Because
mhm,
the more I do, and if I up it, constantly upping it, the
mhm.
more control I have, and yet it sounds like a forever, never-ending thing. But then with food, I think it's interesting because, and here we are entering Christmas, like, a lot of food is associated with celebration.
Yes.
Right, and people are always bringing in donuts, or people
Mhm,
are Christmas, and there's all this food and all this. But I also personally, and I have that association, but I also personally can certainly relate to the idea of food as a way of self-soothing. If I
yeah,
feel lonely, if I feel hurt or sad or shameful or something, some bad emotion,
mhm,
and food becomes the way that I can soothe myself. And so, and then there might be then added shame to that, feeling of shame that I've done that, possibly. And yet, so I don't know how to, you know what I mean? Like, is food something that is a celebration of something, or is it a soothing or escape from something? And I
it can
guess,
be both. So I would really encourage people. There is a dietitian named Ellen Satter, and she has a beautiful definition of food that is not in front of me right now. So she has it's a wonderful quote, but basically food can do many things. We can use it to celebrate. Sometimes I mean, I was even thinking, you were saying celebrations, oh, Christmas and things, but in a lot of cultures, after a funeral, we
mm,
get together and grieve and share food together.
right,
And I know my family's Italian. That's something that we do. And so it's just a time to get so celebrating life, but also grieving together. And yes, food does have a place in times, you know, sometimes if you have a bad day as a kid, oh, want to have some ice cream and cheer up or something like that. We use food. Sometimes eating food is a mindless activity. We
mhm,
sit in front of the TV and maybe have popcorn or whatever, snack while we watch TV. Sometimes we're very mindful about it.
yeah,
So Ellen Satter, if we were to read her quote, she includes all these different aspects. And I think it's a really beautiful quote that food can serve many different purposes, and that doesn't make it good or bad. Uh, and I think also you were saying that food, as an escape, I think it's important, and I'm very open about this too, that my eating disorder was not just anorexia. So it morphed. And this
right,
is something that I wanted to share with our listeners today, that eating disorders don't always stay in one box.
okay,
They tend to run on a spectrum. Many people have heard about anorexia and bulimia is characterized by binge eating or extreme overeating with a lot of the feelings of shame
mm.
associated that you had mentioned.
I think
As
of
well.
Princess Diana, being Canadian.
Pardon?
I'm Canadian originally, and so I think of Princess Diana when I
Yes,
hear that.
Princess Diana. Yes. And
Yeah,
so it's also characterized by the purge, the ridding of the food. And that can be through vomiting, through diuretics, it can be through laxatives. It can also be sometimes exercise is considered as a way of purging.
mhm,
It can be, it's different for everybody. So there's those, but nowadays in the DSM-5, we now have something called binge eating disorder, which before was a disorder that was being researched, up until the DSM-4. That was DSM-5, excuse me, I might have
and just
misspoke.
in case anybody listening doesn't know what DSM
Yes.
is, that's the manual that mental health professionals use to diagnose mental health disorders.
Yes, yes. And so thank you for sharing that with everybody. Yes, I'm saying all the terms like,
Very cool. No,
yes.
this is awesome. This is very interesting.
So before that, it was an area that was under research, but was not its own full diagnostic.
Mhm.
It was not its own diagnosis. So binge eating disorder is characterized by overeating, but no purging. That is, so in my own life, I experienced anorexia, and then over time it shifted to binge eating disorder for various reasons. And, they were not always clear to me when I was in it, but through therapy, I was able to really come out on the other side and learn a lot about myself and why, what was.
So this is so fascinating. Actually, really, I would love.
Good.
I feel like we could talk about this all day, and it would be so interesting. But I am wondering for our listeners, like, because I know, like, I can hear myself in some of that. Like, certainly, the binge eating without the purging, I can relate to sometimes, or the binge eating, especially in the holidays, and then like, okay, now I have to kill myself for a week, right? I know that's not healthy. I know that's not the way. Why can't I just be moderate, even over the holidays, right? And all this, and what's going on, and what emotional things are coming up for me during the holidays that cause me to take that perspective. So I have those questions that come up, and maybe our listeners, some of them are too. So what should you do if you identify it in yourself or in someone else? What steps should one take?
I want to urge everyone to be gentle with themselves and with other people. So if you are noticing struggles or questions coming up, like you were saying about this time of year, I honestly think really it's from Halloween through New Year's that we really get, I want to use the word assaulted, but like food comes at us that with, we emphasize candy on Halloween. Thanksgiving is usually a very difficult time for people suffering from eating disorders. And as you said, Christmas, I mean, we've got treats all over the place. And then New Year's, people often say, I have a resolution to stop all of this.
Right.
And so it's almost like a twisted Lent, that people are like, because it's it can be for many people very detached from God. These resolutions. So anyway, I think it's a broad span of time, even broader than this is just a hard time of year for people. And I say to be gentle because when you mentioned, say, moderation, like, why can't I be moderate all the time? Getting back to the idea of Ellen Satter's definition that food serves many purposes, and it's okay sometimes to overeat. It's okay at times to not eat as much as you're hungry for. That for various reasons, sometimes we're in a rush, for example, and we can't eat a meal as quickly or as nicely and mindfully as we'd like. And we don't get as much as we would hope for because we don't have time or something. And sometimes we're in the presence of a lot of food and family and friends, and it's a jovial time and we want to enjoy. So putting a moral judgment on food is often unhelpful.
Right.
There's also something to consider about disordered eating versus eating disorder. So we all can have times of disordered eating when our eating isn't completely, I don't want to use the word perfect, but it doesn't meet what we need, what our body physically needs, because food is really fuel at some point, right? Food starts as fuel for our bodies to give us the energy we need to complete the tasks that we have, or just for our basic body processes, for breathing, we need to get through the day. And then food we've developed many attachments to food, often that are related to feelings, like you were saying. So I think giving ourselves grace and gentleness and recognizing when we want to berate ourselves for being quote unquote bad, that food is just food and there's no good or bad food. And the way that because when we start speaking to ourselves badly, and most of the time you won't say to another person, like, you're so bad, you had that cookie. We would mostly say, oh, I can't believe I had that cookie. I'm so bad. I shouldn't do that.
Right.
we speak to ourselves in much harsher language, and that is something that can start to have an impact on our self-esteem and start to really fuel those body image and eating disorder related thoughts. So I would urge people to be gentle, take a step back, really try to detach from the use of language that is not helpful, such as, oh, that's such a, that food has XYZ in it. And that's such a bad food, or I'm cheating. We use a lot of terminology that's not
Mm,
helpful.
okay.
This is my cheat day. This is my, oh, I earned this food. Food is not something to be earned, or it's so this is the moral judgments are so hard, because then, especially even if you're not personally suffering from an eating disorder or struggles with food, disordered eating behaviors at all, you might be talking to someone in your family or friend group who does, and they might start to internalize it. If
Okay.
Gerry thinks that about himself, I'm using you as an example, just
I think I've done that though.
but
Where the things I've said, maybe I don't think about it affect other people around me.
sure. And I
They
think,
go, he must think that about me then.
right, that's where I was going to go exactly with that, and most of the time we're not really thinking about other people. We don't recognize what other people are eating the way that we recognize that we're personally eating. And so
Right.
that we might say, oh my goodness, I meant nothing by that comment. But to the listener, to somebody who is struggling in this area, they might worry
Right.
and start to become anxious. And then that can turn them inward and separate you guys in relationship. And that's where I think the danger lies. So that's a big point that I want to drive home for people, especially
Yeah.
at this time of year.
Yeah. The way that I see food relating to things like other kinds of addiction, whether it's substance abuse, like alcohol, or
Mhm.
sex, even,
Yeah.
because I guess they're related to the appetites, and
Yes.
and the trick with food is actually the most challenging, because you could avoid alcohol completely if you really want to,
Yep.
right? And or sex, I guess,
Mhm.
but
Yeah.
but that's not healthy, especially in a married situation. You
Sure.
are also meant to um be intimate. So, but food you really have to have.
Yes.
So it really challenges us to actually face the demon here, because I think that, and I'm maybe not using the right word to say demon, but what I mean is that if there's a part of me that's lonely or sad, and I'm using food to kind of numb that and just
Mhm.
make myself feel better, I really probably need to look at that, and actually address the lonely sad part, right?
Yes.
Like actually take care of that part in a good way, in a loving way, in a healthy way. And like you were saying before about relationships, maybe even in a relational way, by reaching out and all this. And so, and in a prayerful way, in a spiritual, reaching to God too. So it challenges us to face that, hopefully, and I think unfortunately, maybe not always and not often, maybe even people don't. It's just a lot easier to reach for another whatever it is in the fridge, or or whatever, to just because that's candy and works quickly
Yes.
but temporarily, to
Yes.
relieve that bad feeling. Does that all resonate? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I want to say, yeah, completely, that a lot of times the numbing piece, not just for people who are overeating, but restriction leads to numbing too. And
Mm,
so both behaviors can have the same effect on the person in terms of their their feelings of emotionally and mentally speaking. So there, that you can have this numbing because the feelings are too overwhelming to feel. So there's too much going on. So I need to numb out.
right.
And, by restricting, that can happen for some people, or exercising, or eating a large capacity of food in a short period of time. So yes, I think that, as you said, it's a temporary fix too, because it can feel like you're almost always, chasing this high, so to speak. So I can see how a lot of people do think about it in terms of addiction. But as you said, one of the most important things to remember is that we really can't abstain from food. I mean, you can live longer without food technically than you could without water, but you need food to survive.
Well,
And you don't need alcohol. You don't need drugs, hard drugs or anything. And you could live without sex, like you were saying, but that, I mean, not in a married relationship. That's not the purpose,
Yeah.
so yes, it's very hard for me to get on board with the idea of something like Overeaters Anonymous or something, because of the fact that it's not, I think that we can't just get rid of food, right? We just can change our relationship with it. And I suppose some people could argue that, yes, that's a way that you change your relationship with it, is cutting out certain foods that are tempting or lead to overeating. But I would prefer to, if I had the choice, I would prefer to help people learn how to manage that relationship in a better way than to just cut things out completely.
Right. Well, in fact, I think it's interesting, the readings, and the Psalm says, so fascinating. Psalm 128, it says, blessed are those who fear the Lord and all that. But then it goes on to say, for you shall eat the fruit of your handiwork. And it goes on to say, your wife shall be like a fruitful vine, your children like olive plants. And I think I like that because they're food images. It's like food is something that is beautiful and it's produced in nature, and it's, it is enjoyed, but we work, normally you're gardening or you're whatever you're doing, you're farming, we work to create this food. And so it's actually something beautiful, just like sex is, in the proper context, is beautiful, and so on. And even alcohol can be, I mean, in the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist itself includes wine, right? And it's a sign of celebration. So in the proper order, it is actually wonderful and beautiful and celebratory. And yet, unfortunately, because of our fallen nature, because of our wounds, because of this or that, we actually, sometimes, misuse things. And so, like, I think what I'm hearing you say is, it's rather than avoid or just cut out, we have to learn to manage it and really have a relationship with it that's healthy.
Yes, I think that there is a really big misunderstanding of the virtue of temperance and what it means to actually be temperate. Temperance doesn't mean eliminating everything that's tempting, but learning how to manage these appetites. And so it's funny because it's been a while since I looked at it, but my dissertation involved the virtue of temperance, and how there's just that people tend to think, especially when it comes to food, we think of it as all of this cutting back and avoiding and restricting. And I think that there, especially people with eating disorders, not that I would say that most people with eating disorders sit and think about the virtue of temperance and how do I live this out appropriately, but that they are very misguided in terms of what, how they would define temperance is elimination, restriction, avoiding, versus how do I interact with that food in a reasonable way.
Yeah. And, we're going to have to wrap up in a minute. A whole bunch of topics are coming up for me. Like, I would love to discuss with you what a healthy way to fast would be.
Yes.
Especially maybe for Lent.
Mm-hmm.
Now I attend an Eastern Catholic church. And so we've been doing the Phillips fast, which I don't know that a lot of Roman Catholics think about Advent that way. They just think, it's all just putting up decorations and starting the food binge. Yeah. But it actually is, part of the preparation is fasting. And I think that also could be abused, possibly. Yes. But I'd love to hear more about that. But I have to not go there. But I'm going to
not today,
plant that seed, maybe for Lent. So, Dr. Laura, what a pleasure to have you on here, and what interesting! It's so helpful and interesting, and this topic I think is relevant for women and men, and all people, and because food is just essential to our living, and how do we actually have a good and healthy relationship with that? Well, I'm going to have to thank you and start the wrap up on this. I hope you will, if you're listening, we'll have some information about Dr. Laura in the show notes if you're interested in hearing more about her. I'm going to be kind of challenging her to send me a little blog. I'd love to get a blog on our site.
I'll write that down.
Yeah, and maybe have you on again sometime. So,
That'd be great.
and also I'm going to encourage our listeners to go on over to Hear the Word. If you haven't already, I'm going to be doing a meditation on these readings. I think I'm going to do, I was talking about a moment ago, those wounded selves, right? Those parts of ourselves that are carrying, are struggling with loneliness, sadness, even over the holidays, because that happens sometimes very in sharp ways. Even amidst joy and celebration, there can be moments of loneliness and loss and so on. And my meditation is going to be focused on how to meet those parts with love and grace and kindness and healing, rather than turning to something else like just binge eating or any other option. So I hope you'll enjoy that meditation. And of course, come to soulsandhearts.com. If you haven't already, you can just register and you'll get our weekly updates where you'll hear about blogs coming up, like maybe Dr. Laura's, and you'll hear about other items, communities we're building, all kinds of stuff on Souls and Hearts. So thank you so much for listening, and we look forward to seeing you next time. And until then, be still, believe, and be loved. Take good care.